As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
The changing my expectations is the first step, and it might help me to push myself out of my comfort zone or to deal with the thing that's upsetting me. It's this kind of iterative process. It's like I'm focusing on the journey. It's not like I'm immediately expecting like everything to be solved just with one change in mindset, but actually it's an important tool that's helping me to make the progress I want, more quickly and with less discomfort than I would have otherwise felt.
That was David Robson on Psychologists Off the Clock. We are 3 clinical psychologists here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas from psychology to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act Daily Journal, the Act Daily Card Deck, and the upcoming book, Act for Burnout.
I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, a Boston-based clinical psychologist, assistant professor at Brown University, and author of the book Work, Parent, Thrive.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, the Big Book of Act Metaphors, and the upcoming Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
This is Yael here with Debbie to introduce an episode that I'm really, really excited about. The book that I got to discuss with the author, David Robson, is called The Expectation Effect: How Mindset Can Change Your World. And as any listener of the podcast knows, I love books, but this is one of those books that I've literally been telling everyone that they have to read. It's a really transformative book. It's a fun read, but it will change your mind, and your mind changing will change your day-to-day experience in some really surprising, cool, powerful ways.
You told me this the other day, and I listened to this episode, and I immediately followed your advice because I trust your instincts on that.
Yeah, this is probably one of my top recommended books of the past year. And there were so many take-homes. So I'm curious, Debbie, what were some of the main things that stuck out for you as you listened?
I mean, there were so many. I guess I was familiar with some of the concepts in the conversation. Of course, things like the placebo effect and that kind of thing. For instance, when they prime people for certain traits, they'll perform better or worse on a math test and those kinds of things. So definitely was a little bit familiar with some of the concepts, but to hear it framed in this particular way and to think about the impact on our daily lives, I thought it was really fascinating. And I have an example, which was one of my children, who shall remain nameless, I'm not trying to out anybody here, had a tough morning where things just were not going her way. It was like, couldn't find anything to wear and woke up too late and was tired. And she said to me, my whole day is ruined. Everything's going to be terrible today. And I just said to her, listen, I know that this is a tough morning, but let's not go into the day just assuming that it's going to be terrible all day long. I mean, I think sometimes we think that it's like, I'm tired, or I didn't get enough sleep, or I woke up on the wrong side of the bed this morning, or, I ran out of paper towels, or whatever the case may be. And we almost expect that means the whole day is going to be terrible. And then you think about, well, what does it look like when you go into your day expecting that and sort of locked into how terrible everything is? It might actually cause you to have a pretty terrible day because you're going to be really attuned to everything that's going wrong. You might, I don't know. So I'm trying to get a little bit out of that mindset. I think this book really validates that concept.
It does, and from this super cool science-backed way, because what he does in the book, and he describes it in our conversation too, is he describes how our brain is really a prediction machine. And it's not just preparing us behaviorally, it actually sets the stage physiologically. So for example, if you think you're going to be eating a meal that is heavy in calories, your body prepares for that. Versus if you think you're going to be eating a meal that is light in calories, your body prepares for that. Same thing goes if you think that you're going to get sick or you're sick and that your recovery will be slow, your brain preps your body for that at a physiological level. So it's funny that you're saying that you kind of use some of this evidence with your kids, because I've been doing the same. First of all, as I was reading it, I was like, there's some really cool visual stimuli that he actually walks the reader through in the book that I showed my kids, like, okay, what do you see here? And then like later on, you get a different cue and you see something totally different. So experientially, this book is pretty cool, and I was involving my kids in it. But also I've been like sharing with them all these different tools that come from this research on the expectation effect, from, how my kids go into their sports games. So one of my kids is deep into soccer and is struggling with, he really wants to make more goals. And so, some of the data suggests that if you do visual imagery, then it creates these neural pathways in the brain that make it much more likely for you to be able to perform the activity that you most want to perform. So there's actually something to the science of practicing in your mind. And then one of my kids got the stomach flu, and the science suggests that if we think that we're taking medicine, that our body prepares to that's part of the placebo effect, that our body prepares us to get better more quickly. So we were like joking that I was giving him medicine and that we were trying to initiate the expectation effect. So there's all these really fun little tools that the science really helps us access and use to our benefit, both in terms of increasing positive experiences and better managing the harder experiences that are unavoidable.
This is where I love when these psychology experiments are done, and they're so fascinating intellectually, but it can help you be aware of these kinds of things. And sometimes that awareness makes a huge difference. Just knowing about some of these things can help you, just be less likely to fall into some of the traps that we tend to get into without realizing it. And so I love that, because you can almost take this information and these really interesting studies and see ways to apply it in your life.
100%. And I hope everyone listens all the way to the end of this episode, because David actually shares some of the ways that he's used these tools to manage his own mental health in really helpful, practical, accessible ways. So we hope that you listen all the way to the end and that you pick up the book, because it's a really good read. Hi, I'm here with David Robson, who's an award-winning science writer specializing in the extremes of human brain, body, and behavior. David has written for The Guardian, The Atlantic, New Scientist, Men's Health, and many more. His first book was The Intelligence Trap, and his second, which we are here to discuss today, is The Expectation Effect: How Your Mindset Can Change Your World. The Expectation Effect has won all sorts of awards, and I heard about it on a podcast that I was interviewed on. The host told me he thought I'd love it, and I do. I read it, and I cannot stop recommending it to everyone. This is really one of those must-read books, and I'm so excited to discuss it with you today, David. Welcome, and thank you so much for making the time to chat with me.
No, it's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So the topic of this book may initially seem like one of those, if you believe it, you can make it so books, and yet it really couldn't be more different than books like The Law of Attraction or The Secret. But you're calling readers' attention to this fantastic and sort of fantastical power that the mind has in making expectations become a reality. So I'm really excited to dive into the science of this. So to start off with, one of the ways that you describe the mind is as a prediction machine. I wonder if you can tell the listeners what you mean by this.
Yeah, this is kind of really fundamental to the book, because like you say, it's not kind of pseudoscience, and it's not claiming that anything is possible just with the power of thought. It's like founded on a very good scientific theory, and that is this idea that the brain is this prediction machine, where it's constantly building simulations of the world around it, and it's drawing on its previous experiences and then like contextual clues within the environment that then it's using to simulate the world around it. And so from those simulations, those predictions are actually shaping the way it processes the sensory data. So if the sensory data is quite ambiguous, which often it is, the simulations can help kind of fill in the gaps or, organize it more sensibly so we can extract meaning from what we're receiving, the data we're receiving. And so that can, result in lots of perceptual illusions, but actually most of the time it works great. It's very accurate. But also what happens with these simulations is that they help the brain to kind of prepare the body for the challenges that it's going to face in the seconds, minutes, even hours ahead of it. So things like the stress response, the balance of hormones that you might be experiencing, the actions of the gut, the actions of the circulatory system. So it's really changing our kind of subjective, conscious, perceptual reality, but also then our actual physical reality, what the body is doing.
And I think that is such a pivotal, really eye-opening insight that your book really nails down in so many different pockets of our lives, that our expectations help us prepare, but not just through action. Like, there's actual physiological changes that occur internally, physiologically, when we're anticipating certain things. And you cover areas from like how we anticipate of how calorie rich a food is going to be, or how painful a workout is going to be, or how effective we think a medication is going to be. And we'll talk about some of those specific areas. But, I've read a lot of mindset research, and you talk, for example, about Alia Crum's hotel workers study that a lot of people are familiar with. And maybe we can even just start there, because it was one of the best. I think I had never fully understood how it is that telling somebody that they're going to be doing that the work that they do is going to burn more calories causes them to burn more calories. It's really fascinating. So maybe you can help us unpack that study a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the studies that really attracted me to kind of write the book, because I think like we have studied the placebo effect in medicine for so long that we actually, we know our expectations can have these physiological effects, but that had always been limited to the hospital ward or the kind of clinic, rather than saying that actually similar expectation effects are happening in everyday life. And I think that was what was so great about Alia's research. I mean, in this study, she educated these hotel cleaners essentially about the energetic demands of their work, and showed that actually, when you're moving beds or doing the vacuuming, cleaning windows, you're burning calories, and it meets the kind of Surgeon General's recommendations for physical exercise each week. And she kind of gave them that talk and then left some kind of leaflets around the hotels to help them to kind of absorb that information and remind them of that information. And then a month later, she found that they did see some physiological changes. They had lower blood pressure. They kind of fell below the threshold now of having problematically high blood pressure, and they also seemed to lose a couple of pounds. And questionnaires, didn't seem to show any differences in their lifestyles. It's not like they had started eating less or actively going to the gym. So it was really puzzling kind of why that would be. One possibility is that they were just kind of doing more work. They felt more enthusiastic, putting a bit more oomph into their cleaning. But that didn't seem to be the case from, what their supervisors were saying. And they certainly hadn't changed their hours. And so it really did look like there was this kind of placebo effect. Now, why that is still under discussion, I think. But there's, lots of other studies that have looked at placebo effects in sports. And, we do know that when you raise people's expectations of their fitness, that can actually change, how they work out. So it can change the efficiency of their movements, and even physiological markers like the exchange of gas within their lungs becomes more efficient. So they're kind of getting rid of more carbon dioxide, pulling in more oxygen through this expectation effect. So there's lots of potential mechanisms. It could also be due to the fact that they were feeling more positive, and that was changing their balance of stress hormones like cortisol, which could also have an effect on things like metabolism. So there are multiple pathways there. But, this study, taken within a larger body of studies looking at physiological effects of expectations, does seem very convincing. They're just, recognizing the exercise that you're doing as exercise can have positive effects for your health.
Yeah. And I will say, so I've read the original study, and I've, for the longest time, really thought that probably what happened is they were just more, energetic in the way that they were cleaning, and they must have burned more calories that way. But after reading your book, I am really convinced that the expectations really do kind of help you set up your body in a way to take advantage of activity, of physical activity. And again, this is sort of like one example among many where expectations can really change sort of how your body prepares to engage in whatever kind of task. So it kind of begs this broad question. I'm going to ask this sort of overly broad, simplistic question that I know is very complicated, and then we'll dive into some of the more specific pockets of functioning that you cover in your book. But do you think that there's a simple answer to the question of whether it's better to be an optimist, have positive expectations, and deal with hard things as they come up, or a pessimist and be able to better prepare for the hard stuff?
I'm going to try to avoid that question slightly, in that I won't give like a binary answer, in that I think that there is a really sweet spot in between the two that's optimal, actually. I think to be overly pessimistic is inherently irrational, just like being overly optimistic is. And that, you should never kind of have this binary way of looking at the world where everything's either positive or either negative. It should depend on the situation. But I think what we can do when we're applying the expectation effect is just try to make sure that we're not needlessly negative, and that we have this kind of open mind, and that then we're able to apply these techniques like reframing to the situation at hand. So that's not denying the facts of what's happening, but rather changing your interpretation of those facts. So, one example that I love with working out again is that, if you've been a bit of a couch potato all your life, and you go to the gym and then you start working out, you can start to really catastrophize the feelings of exercise. Things like your heart racing, you're struggling for breath. It can feel like you're ill, like you worry about your muscles aching, but actually, it can be uncomfortable, while simultaneously also you can interpret those symptoms that you're feeling as being something positive. It's actually a sign that you're pushing your body to its current limit, and it's going to bring about growth and development and strength. And you can focus on the fact that you're actually, building more strength for the future, while still acknowledging that it can feel quite unpleasant. That's just one example, but that's what I really think we want to do, is to get to that kind of sweet spot. And actually all of the other expectation effects that I talk about really, depend on reaching that kind of Goldilocks zone where you're changing your interpretation of events without denying the facts or denying the discomfort that you might be feeling.
Well, I love that answer of suggesting that people find this sweet spot, and that it really gets informed by how your expectations can best help you capitalize on whatever it is that you're doing or trying to work towards. And the reason that I asked the question is I am a couples specialist. I do a lot of couples therapy and study relationships. And this comes up a lot, right? This difference of like one partner being a real optimist and the other being a pessimist, and them both arguing for the value of each of their approaches to expecting outcomes. And I think you're absolutely right, which is, it's really that sweet spot. And actually, if they can sort of take advantage of the middle ground between them, it works quite well. But I want to use that to kind of segue into another couples related question, which has to do with how we hear one another. And this, again, comes up a lot in intimate partnerships. So people perceive the exact same stimuli differently, or situations totally differently. So, one example that's just kind of a funny example is if one person says this room is really hot, and they're hoping that their partner, gets the hint and turns on a fan, and then the other one thinks that they're flirting and, coming on to them and, making a romantic invite. And both are so mad because the other person isn't understanding the actual meaning of their words, but the way that they contextualize the words is so different. So based on the research, we know that we can come away with totally different understandings of the exact same event and the world at large. And you talk a lot about this in the book. And so how can we understand the way that our interpretations of events can be so different when it's the exact same event?
I think that, that is crucial, because actually, there has been some research on kind of mindset, people, who have these different mindsets. And you do find that, say, people who have kind of non-limited mindset about willpower, for example. Like there are some people who think that the, willpower is essentially self-perpetuating. It's, keeps its own momentum. And, those people then do, through an expectation effect, end up having more self-control, and they find it easier to resist temptation and to stick to their goals. Now, the problem is that because they have that experience, they find it really difficult to empathize with people who have the opposite mindset, that willpower is limited and that, it's going to wear out quickly. So when they see their partner, stopping work to kind of watch TV or, because they need a break, they're like, no, you should just keep on going. And it's, they're basically, if you see mindsets as these kinds of, lenses through which we view the world and our own behavior and other people's behaviors, they're seeing very different things, that they're experiencing very different things. And it can be difficult to bridge that divide. But I think what, with my understanding of the expectation effect and mindsets, is that actually what it's really helped me to understand is that I'm not saying that there's no objective truth, but I mean, like, both mindsets end up being true through this self-fulfilling prophecy. And that, in a way, like, I think that awareness, when you understand that, it can actually help you to kind of bridge that divide. Because, like, say my partner does have, I'll say, more of a limited view of willpower. And when I see his, like, he's struggling with these things, well, it's like I can recognize that actually he's really experiencing that through this self-fulfilling prophecy, and that it's not an excuse. It's actually, there are good psychological and physiological mechanisms why it's having that effect. And so I think, like, we do have to kind of be compassionate and empathetic to people. And even if, their mindsets are leading them to behave in ways that seem alien to us because we have a different mindset, I think actually just recognizing that, and recognizing that, there are two different psychological mechanisms and both can be true for different people, I think that can be really helpful.
Yeah, I love how you're describing it, and my partner probably feels that way about me in terms of the ego depletion. But yeah. And I think that's also a common difference. I actually want to talk about that particular finding, but I'm going to put a pin in it for just one sec, because I think what you're saying is so powerful. And it maybe goes to help us understand our partner, as well as to unhook a little bit ourselves from the stories that we tell about how the world is, is with a truth with a capital T. Because when we recognize that we're each guided through the world by a set of beliefs, and we hold on to them because it helps us to develop a coherent understanding and helps us to prepare and helps us to anticipate what's going to happen, it helps us to sort of recognize that, like, that is one set of beliefs, and that there are lots of alternative sets of beliefs, and our partner may hold a different one, but that, there's not like a right or wrong. It's just sort of something that helps you develop coherence and plan accordingly. And that most sets of beliefs have some flaws because there's no way to capture all of the truth of the world in one set of beliefs anyway.
Right, exactly. And also I think, some sets of beliefs, like you kind of said, is they can be adaptive in one context, but not another. So actually, I think, there could be, as a couple, you might be stronger to have the variety of beliefs between you, which means that you can navigate different challenges and play to your strengths. But again, I just think it is the key there for me would be to have that awareness of what those two different ways of viewing the world are, and respect for the other person's way of viewing the world, and then trying to work out, well, like, how can we, use this to our advantage rather than seeing it as a point of conflict.
One other point that I want to bring up in this couples domain is sort of literally that context matters so much for how we understand what's happening. You give this really interesting example of a study of a musician virtuoso who's playing in a subway, and because people aren't expecting to hear a virtuoso playing in the subway, they don't notice it. Whereas if that same individual were playing in a concert hall, they would get rapt attention, and people would really appreciate the beauty of their music. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit to that context effect that really directs our expectations in particular ways, and then impacts how we experience the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, again, it's that prediction machine creating those simulations, and that's actually shaping the way that your brain is processing the sensory data. And in the context of music, I think it just might be, what you're listening out for in the, the phrasing of that violinist's playing, or, the quality of the sound that they're creating. It's like if you're in the subway, your attention just isn't going to be focused so much on that. So you're just not going to, you expect that they're, maybe someone who, is still a student, or maybe they dropped out of music school. You're just not thinking of it in the same terms. So yeah, it can be exactly the same sound, but the simulations are changing the way that you process that sound. And actually, I think, like, coming back to this idea of, how this plays out in couples, I quote from, one of Anais Nin's novels, where, there's this kind of thinly veiled, character who's like the kind of Henry Miller figure, and there's the Anais Nin figure, and they're walking along the Seine in France, and he only sees all of the garbage and how dirty it is, and she sees like how beautiful the water is and the play of the light and the bridges, and that is how I think, like, as couples, sometimes we can walk through exactly the same place, but we can be worlds apart in what we're experiencing.
I think that is so well put. You give this other example that's sort of like we can miss what's in front of us, or we can create something out of nothing. Can you describe the white noise studies and the Bing Crosby music? That it was so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same phenomenon, but I feel like at a real extreme. So, there was one study that looked at kind of visual white noise. They primed people to kind of think that they were going to see faces, and sometimes there were actually outlines of faces appearing in the white noise, but, other times it was pure white noise. But because the participants expected to see faces, they actually started reporting seeing them in the white noise, even when they weren't there. And you could even see the brain activity in the FFA. I think that's the fusiform face area in the brain that's, used for facial recognition. So the neural activity was almost indistinguishable from when they actually saw the faces. And they, then exactly the same thing happened when they played audio of white noise and told participants that they were going to hear Bing Crosby singing. They were going to hear White Christmas. And, even when there wasn't a trace of the song, for about 30% of the time, about a third of the time, these participants reported actually hearing it in the white noise. And what I think is happening there is that the prediction machine, the song is so familiar, and the expectation of hearing it was leading the brain as a prediction machine to actually start simulating it. As simulations were so strong, and it was shaping that sensory processing so much that it felt like a real conscious phenomenon.
Yeah. It's really wild how the processes of the mind can sort of really have such a monumental shift in how you experience the world. And what's so interesting, so your book is just replete with science, but what's so important to recognize is that science also helps to shape our mindsets and our expectations. And you had mentioned this before, the ego depletion effect, or sort of how we understand how willpower can get depleted over time through the course of the day. And this was sort of a finding that used to go one way, and now more recently has turned a different direction. And I think it's so interesting because if you had bought into the science before, as I did, it really feels untrue to me, the new findings. So what are those findings? But also, what are your thoughts on how science can really impact people's expectation effects and how that can evolve over time?
Yeah, I mean, they're both fundamental points. And I think actually the second one, gives room for optimism, even though in this case, I think, that is a bit problematic. But yeah, essentially, we'd had this view for ages that, willpower was depleted, that this might even be linked to kind of some kind of limited resource within the brain, like glucose, that's then used up as you're, in the classic study, as you're like resisting the temptation to eat cookies, and instead you're eating radishes or whatever it was.
At the beginning of the day, and then by the end of the day, you're like, oh, I'm all used up with the willpower, I'm going to eat the cookies.
Right, that's it. Because, like after, a full day of kind of sticking to work when you could be doing, looking at funny YouTube videos, holding your tongue when your boss says something really annoying and you really want to snap, but you have to like smile and, pretend to like their suggestion, all of those things were thought to kind of deplete willpower. And then, by the end of the day, you're really low on reserve. So rather than going to the gym, you might watch, a box set, or, and you might have junk food rather than sticking to a healthier diet. And, that there had been some problems with replicability with some of the laboratory experiments. But I think in general, like the kind of longer term, effects of the ego depletion did seem to be true still. But what the research kind of has suggested is that maybe this was a mindset effect. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. And what these researchers like Veronica Job, who was in Switzerland at the time, what she discovered was that actually, there are broadly two mindsets. Some people who seem to think of willpower as being depleted, the others who see willpower as being self-perpetuating, has its own momentum. You get into the zone when you're working, and actually it's easy to stay focused once you're actually already doing a task. If you've resisted cookies throughout the day, it's like, you've got stronger, it's not so hard in the evening. And she looked at this in short-term laboratory tests, but also then, broader kind of measures of people's self-control in their daily lives. And she found that those willpower mindsets, have real important consequences for how much people exercise, how well students deal with the stress of exams, how much they procrastinate, all of these things. And, she also found interestingly that even though in the West, the limited willpower mindset is more common, that in countries like India, the non-limited mindset was more common. So, it seems to be something about our cultures that, that have led to these self-fulfilling prophecies. But she found that by educating people about the different mindsets, so people who had the limited mindset who were educated about the non-limited mindset and given a bit of information about those studies, that they could shift their mindset, and it seemed to then have an effect on their behavior. So that is positive. I think that our mindsets are malleable. But like you said, what happens if you read all of those books about limited willpower? Like, was that actually reinforcing this idea? And was that then leading people to struggle even more with their self-control? My hunch, like no one's tested that particular idea of the effects of that science, but my hunch is that it would have done so actually. And that, that's why we have to be careful, I think, in science communication often. And I think we can see the same with, maybe some of the messages about stress, for example. Like if you paint stress as being universally bad and dangerous and a kind of precursor to failure, that's reinforcing an idea that then can create a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we do have to be careful with these things. And I think it really tells us that we should be nuanced in our messaging. But I think, ultimately it's a good sign that our mindsets are malleable, because it does mean that, knowledge is power. By educating people about the expectation effect, that people can actually then put new beliefs into use, and that, with the scientific evidence behind them, it's not like you need to deceive people. Just knowing the facts about mindsets can be enough to bring about that initial change.
Yeah, I mean, there's this kind of fundamental truth that if you are able in so many different pockets of life to adopt a mindset, that you can find a way through and grow from hard things and learn and make realities work well for you, if you sort of look out for opportunities to do that there's often a possibility to do that. And I think the willpower effect, the ego depletion effect, is such an interesting one, because it is like a mindset shift that you can, with that knowledge, do for yourself. Like, oh, okay, there's a way to think about this as a resource that gets diminished by the end of the day. But there's also a way to think of this as, oh, I've been practicing all day, and now I have all this practice under my belt and a way to go about doing it. And that really can change how I go about my diet, or my willingness to hold my tongue, or my, efforts at getting my work done carefully.
Right. And what I think, talking of nuance, I think, is that actually, people do broadly, according to Veronica's research, do broadly seem to fall, on one side of the spectrum or the other. But actually it does depend on context again. And so it could be that, when it comes to like resisting cookies, you actually do find that your mind power is like non-limited. Once you start, you find that it is easier. While you might have been previously struggling with like focusing and concentrating on your work, and you might have simultaneously had the belief, well, in that domain, your willpower is very limited and that, it's easily depleted. But I think what this research shows is that, you can try to, maybe it would help if you think of the one domain where you do show really good willpower, and you can use that to reinforce this idea that your willpower is within your control, and that is empowering. And then you can try to kind of take that with you to all of those other areas of life where you might find it harder to practice self-control. And that is something that I, try to do myself. When there's a task I don't want to do and that I do, would tend to have the idea that, I need regular breaks and that, my productivity is falling and I can excuse myself for procrastinating. Well, actually with those, I'd think no, if I'm writing, which is my real passion, I can get in the zone and I can write for hours without even noticing time passing. And that does really show that there isn't this, because it's hard mental work, so that resource should be depleted. But in that case, it's not. So I can try to think, well, if that's the case there, then maybe when I'm doing, those other tasks that I'm currently finding a bit more depleting, well, maybe, I can just kind of try to apply the same mindset there. And, personally for me, that's worked really well.
Yeah, I love that tip. So I want to talk a bit, you spend a good amount of time in the book talking about the placebo effect and then something called the nocebo effect that people might be less familiar with. And so maybe we can start by having you define those and then dive into some of the science there too.
Right. I mean, yeah, I think people are familiar with the basic concept of the placebo effect. And that is, if you are receiving a medical treatment and that you expect it to work, then often it will bring about relief even if you're receiving a sham treatment. Now, we know the placebo effect doesn't work in every case. It can't perform miracles. Say, if you've got a terminal illness like cancer, like having a placebo chemotherapy isn't going to be beneficial. But for lots of treatments, actually, through this mind-body connection that comes from the brain's prediction machine, you do often see physiological changes that accompany those positive beliefs. And, my favorite example would be with pain relief. So if you take a painkiller and you believe that it's, you've had experience with something like morphine and you believe that you're getting a shot of an opioid drug, well, actually the brain then starts to produce its own endogenous opioids that can then help to, reduce the pain, not just at this kind of purely subjective kind of level of kind of having emotional comfort, but that it also, is physiologically somehow changing the pain signaling. There's also studies showing that, positive expectations can shape, things like inflammation in the body, which accompanies lots of illness and can actually contribute to our sick feelings. So, it can be powerful. I think it's really important in determining patients' comfort. And even, there are longer term studies looking at things like recovery from heart surgery. And, I found that study so exciting because these patients weren't taking a deceptive placebo. They were actually just given psychological therapy that was trying to do the job of the placebo. So, before the surgery, they had a few sessions with a psychologist who was helping to allay some of their worries about the surgery and to help them set some kind of optimistic but realistic expectations of what their recovery would look like. So, when they could return to work, when they might be able to go on holiday, that kind of thing. And what they found was that, these patients did leave hospital more quickly than those who had just had this standard treatment as usual without the positive expectation therapy. They returned to work more quickly. They seemed to report lower levels of disability in their recovery. And importantly, it did also then change some of the physiological markers of recovery. So they had lower levels of certain inflammatory cytokines that might have been slowing their progress. So, it all added up to a kind of healthier return to their normal life after they'd had this therapy. So that's why I'm so excited about expectation effects, is that they don't need to be kind of deceptive, is actually enough, again, just to give people knowledge, to help to assuage people's fears, all of that. But then the nocebo effect is really the kind of flip side of the placebo effect. And that is where our negative expectations can exacerbate illness or create illness from nothing. So lots of side effects that people experience from their medications, things like nausea, headaches, digestive problems. Sometimes these can be nocebo effects. So we know that if a doctor gives them, the patient's medications and gives them the warnings of those side effects, even if it's a sham treatment, they still report those side effects. So, it's the flip side of the placebo effect, and it's actually working through the same mechanisms where a placebo might reduce inflammation and nocebo, negative suggestion, might increase inflammation. It might change the vasculature in your brain, so you're experiencing a headache, whereas if you have positive reassurance, it might reduce the change the vasculature so you don't have that experience of pain. So yeah, it's the nocebo effect is very powerful, and actually it's something that we should be trying to combat. As much as we should be trying to use the placebo effect, we should be trying to reduce the nocebo effect too, in the way that we frame certain descriptions of side effects, or how we kind of frame people's understanding of their illness.
Yeah, and you talked about sort of an intervention that you did for yourself when you were having a negative side effect, and how helpful that was. So, there's this question of like, if we know that the expectations that we have can strengthen the effects of a treatment or reduce the effects of a nocebo effect, how should we sort of position ourselves with our expectations to get the best, of treatment and avoid the worst of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is what's so exciting, and there's some great work happening in New Zealand with people like Keith Petrie, who's really looking into this. But actually, in terms of like what medical providers can do, I think it's really important for them to just like kind of explain why treatments work and like the rationale behind what they're suggesting to the patients, and to really like make sure that the patients understand that, because, that does seem to kind of, through this kind of placebo mechanism, seems to enhance the benefits of the treatments. And we saw that with the example of the heart surgery study that I spoke about. But there are lots of others, like people who are receiving an iron transfusion for severe anemia. If you explain to the patients like why they're receiving that, what's happening in their bodies when they receive that, like how they might expect their energy levels to change over the next few days and weeks, that actually boosted the benefits that they received. So it changed, the fatigue that they were experiencing and the discomfort. So, and I find that exciting because, as a science communicator, I think like people should really have that understanding and autonomy over, their healthcare. And I think this is, I don't think it costs so much considering the benefits that you're receiving. Like the cost, say, for those heart surgery patients, they left a hospital a few days earlier. The cost of the therapy is tiny compared to the cost of keeping people in hospital. And of course, the added discomfort that the patient is suffering because of being in hospital rather than having the comfort of being at home. So yeah, I think it's so exciting, and it works on so many levels, economically, but most importantly for the patient's benefits.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's so powerful and it's so exciting. On the other side, and this is sort of more from my position as a psychologist who's also interested in psychiatric medication, what we know from randomized controlled trials of active treatment for, say, depression or anxiety with various medications compared to placebo is that a lot of the effect is placebo effect, and yet there are significant side effects. And so, I'm of two minds, because one is, depression and anxiety and other mental health illnesses are so desperately painful. So even if it is placebo, maybe we should just allow people to take it because it's helping. On the other hand, they often do come with side effects, and there's, we don't have perfect knowledge of how some of these medications impact people's physiology long-term or even their mental health long-term. And so there's kind of these open questions. And then you sort of bring up, so this is like a conversation that I've had on the podcast before, but you bring up this really interesting idea of open label use of placebo, of like telling people, this is a placebo and you're going to take it for your depression and it'll probably help. And that actually can help. And this is sort of a multi-layered question, but I'm curious how you understand that to help. If the prediction machine, the expectation effect, is so much carrying the way that medication works, if we know that it's a sham treatment, how are we holding on to that expectation effect? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it is mysterious, but so I think, because there's lots of different open label studies of lots of different illnesses. And I do think it probably, the precise mechanism by which it's working probably depends on, the kind of context and the situation. But, in some sense, I think what we found in medicine is that, like, for things like pain, actually, like, if you look at the evolution of pain, it's there as this kind of warning signal. So physical pain I'm talking about, it's this warning signal, and it's kind of telling you to get to safety and to get help, to get someone to look after you. Now, if you're in a setting, and even if you're given these open label placebos and someone's telling you they're going to be effective, like, we're looking after you by giving you these, that's a ritual, that's a medical ritual that's actually helping to reassure the brain that, like, now it is getting the kind of support that the body needs, that you're safe. And so it can afford to reduce the pain signals in that case, or maybe the discomfort of your inflammation could be affected too, because you can, if you know that you're kind of safe, the body can afford to reduce inflammation, which is a first kind of barrier to infection, and then it can start to the adaptive immune system can kick in, so the production of antibodies, that kind of thing, can kick in to actually target the pathogens themselves. So there's those kinds of mechanisms. It's part of the medical ritual, the sense of being safe that might come from having that open label placebo pill. It's telling you that you're being looked after. But I think there's other things that are happening here too. I think in some of these studies, the scientists gave them the scientific knowledge of the expectation effect. They told them how the brain is operating, how, that the brain is capable of producing this relief, that it can actually produce those endogenous opioids for pain relief, for example. And so I think what's happening there then is that it's kind of giving people a sense of empowerment, and that can also be very important for coping with their illnesses, so it's kind of triggering the kind of healing response in this way. But then some of the studies have also looked at things like conditioning. So if you combine an open label, if you first of all combine someone's conventional drug, their opioid pills, with a particular smell, and then you give the open label placebo but attached to that distinctive smell, then you have this conditioning response, and that's also triggering the body to start to respond as if it's receiving the real drug. And that's not perfect, because the effects of conditioning kind of wear off after a few days, but you can kind of top it up by having maybe a day when you're on the real drugs again, combined with the smell, then going back to the open label placebos. And what that's very effective at doing is helping people to wean themselves off of the drugs. So it's not immediate that they can go kind of cold turkey just having the open label placebos, but you can definitely reduce their dosage significantly. So that's another exciting mechanism that can be used and harnessed with kind of effective, kind of smart strategies. So yeah, I think there's, lots of possibilities there. I think the same is probably true with these with the treatment of depression, for example. It could be that having that kind of medical ritual, the sense of being cared for, could be helpful. There could be an element of conditioning there as well. All of these things can combine to kind of bring about these positive effects. And what we really need to do now is just conduct more of these studies to work out, what's the best particular strategy for particular patients.
Another thing that occurs to me specifically with depression, I'm not sure if you're familiar with something called behavioral activation, but it's a evidence-backed treatment for depression. And I wonder if maybe that there's some piece of that too, that like you're doing something and because you're doing something, that there's an effect on depression, just the doing of something.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And actually, I think something similar is probably important for all of these expectation effects, in that, I talk about there being 3 different mechanisms for these expectation effects. And it can be perceptual, as we mentioned, changing the way we're processing the sensory data to change our subjective experience. It can be physiological, but it can also be behavioral. And actually, they're all interacting. If you feel better temporarily, whether that's from physical pain or from, emotional pain and depression, that can then help you to change your behavior. And then I think that can have a knock-on effect back to the other 2 mechanisms, So if you receive that placebo pill for pain or depression, and then that allows you to become more active, maybe do some exercise, that could then kind of start this kind of more positive, like virtuous cycle of behaviors that's then shaping kind of feeding back into your perception, your physiology, and together they're helping to bring you closer to recovery. So I don't think we should ever kind of look at expectation effects as being like one thing or the other. Actually, they're all working in tandem, but it's kind of the end point that's so important.
Yeah, I talked to another researcher, Tracy Dennis Tawari, and she talked about mindset shifts as really being like a ripple effect, right? It's sort of like you change your expectation and it sort of causes this cascade that can be, a virtuous cycle or a vicious cycle. And so being careful about, sort of how you're setting up your expectations really can create this opportunity to cycle in a new direction.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think that's really clear to me in, say, the effects of mindset on stress. We've been taught stress is dangerous, it's negative, you're going to fail if you're stressed, you should chill out. But actually, we evolved this stress response for good reason. It's not like we only have the fight or flight response or the rest and digest response, but actually, we have like lots of like moderations in like how you can experience stress. And actually, it's more like calibrating the suitable level of stress to the situation that's important. And, what we find is that having a positive stress mindset helps you to do that. And positive stress mindset is simply recognizing that even if you have the discomfort of, anxiety before an exam or giving a public talk, that actually some of those changes that you're feeling, like your racing heart and being kind of your nerves jangling, they can be positive because, you're having more oxygen pumped to your brain, cortisol's keeping you aware and alert. You don't want to be drowsy in these important situations. And then, so you're changing your perceptions of that. And then you see that actually it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy physiologically, and that you have a kind of healthier, more moderate stress response. Is not pushing you towards panic when you stop seeing stress as being your enemy. But also then it's changing things like your creativity. You find it easier to be proactive with your problems and to find novel solutions, which can then in turn help you to deal with the thing that's actually stressing you out, to deal with that more constructively. And then that obviously is going to reduce the stress levels further and help you to actually go on that positive trajectory kind of step by step. And so, yeah, personally for me, that's how I see this, as like the changing my expectations is the first step. And it might help me to push myself out of my comfort zone or to deal with the thing that's upsetting me. But it's this kind of iterative process. It's like I'm focusing on the journey. It's not like I'm immediately expecting like everything to be solved just with one change in mindset, but actually it's an important tool that's helping me to make the progress I want, more quickly and with less discomfort than I would have otherwise felt.
Yeah. Well, I love that point that it's focusing you on the process in a more productive way. And I think the science on the stress mindset is so fascinating. And actually, I'm so glad you turned to talk about that, because the researcher that I spoke to, Tracy Dennis Tawari, we had on our podcast to talk about her book Future Tense, which is all about this stress mindset. Yeah. It's a great book, and it was really fun talking with her. And I'm curious, sort of to dovetail on that, how do you think we can set up the expectation effect when we feel feelings that are more on the level of depression or sadness, right? Because I think it feels more intuitive to understand how to set up a productive, helpful mindset with stress and anxiety, because they are emotions that kind of propel us to take care of things, whereas depression tends to kind of retract us and slow us down. And so what are your recommendations there?
So, I mean, I guess I would say, first of all, I really do think people, mindset is something that can be useful in combination with other treatments, whether that's, cognitive behavioral therapy, behavioral activation, mindfulness treatments, pharmacological solutions. But yeah, like mindset alone should never be like your first port of call. But, from my own experience, I think it can be really helpful when you're already kind of on track to kind of help you to kind of deal with your depression and then to kind of prevent relapse as well. That's what I found personally was, so I had depression in the past, but I really felt like writing The Expectation Effect, understanding all of this science, that really has helped to prevent me from relapsing for a few years now.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's, it's such a positive process for me. Actually, just personally, like notwithstanding like professionally, but just personally for me, like it really did change my life. And I think like what really struck me that was the most important thing concerning depression was actually that I saw a lot of research on how you can kind of have a nocebo effect with negative emotions. In that, what I mean is that the meaning we attach to negative emotions can actually exacerbate our discomfort and prevents us from recovering more quickly. So people who, and I was certainly one of these people, I really feared negative emotions like disappointment, frustration, sadness, loneliness, and I would start to catastrophize them when I felt them. So it's like, partly maybe because of my previous experiences with depression, I, very quickly kind of worked myself up into this kind of panic that if I didn't, eliminate those feelings, I was going to relapse back into depression. And that was, what the research shows is that was really counterproductive for me. And actually, we don't have to kind of embrace these emotions, and we certainly don't want to actively cultivate negative emotions, but we can learn to recognize that sometimes, when you're psychologically healthy and you feel those emotions, they serve a really important purpose in your life. Frustration and disappointment, they help you to kind of change track when things aren't working out. They're like giving you that important signal. Similarly, loneliness, it really hurts if you feel excluded, but it can also tell you that you're, to reach out to other people, to it's a reminder that actually it's a basic need to have social interactions and that you have to pursue that. And so just for me, reading that research, the research shows that when people do have those not positive associations, but kind of more nuanced interpretations of their emotions, their mental health is generally much better. So they're actually much less likely to suffer from depression or anxiety or all of those mental health issues. And for me, that certainly has helped a lot, I think, to just kind of accept my bad moods and disappointments as being this kind of temporary weather, that if it's raining, it's not going to rain for forever, but actually you can sit through the rain and you can accept it without fighting it. And I think that's how I see my negative emotions now, and that helped a lot.
I love that. It really fits. So my co-hosts and I all practice an evidence-based treatment that's similar to cognitive behavioral therapy. It's called acceptance and commitment therapy. If you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
And we talk a lot about sort of learning to relate to our internal experiences in particular ways. And what you're speaking to really is sort of like unhooking a little bit and really noticing what kind of meaning we're attaching to the internal experience and seeing that there are more and less helpful ways to attach to meaning and also to recognize impermanence, right? That emotions come and go, and that often the really uncomfortable ones are really intended to be helpful and they're not tragic, even if they're uncomfortable. And if we can sort of hold them lightly, allow them to help us, but not sort of panic about them, sort of add insult to injury when we experience them, that they can help us and that we can sort of endure them with a bit less discomfort. And that it sounds like you sort of, your understanding of that really comes through the expectation effect, but it's really parallel. I love that.
Yeah, I think it is. And that's what I love about this research on, the expectation effect, is that I think it is, it's drawing on, kind of techniques and strategies and, an understanding of the human mind that we'd seen in cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy, and also in older traditions like Buddhism. But it's just showing different ways that they can be applied, and then kind of showing also that often those same strategies we might use, kind of cognitive restructuring, reframing, actually then they're also having these physiological effects often too. So, but yeah, I think there's so much parallel between all of these different fields.
Yeah, all of these different, disciplines and philosophies in Eastern tradition, right? Sort of way before we were looking at cortisol or other physiological effects, really is true too, right? That expectation effect that is captured in Buddhism is, of learning to look at our internal experience in the right way with the right attitude. And the fact that it all converges makes it seem very, very true, and that we can rely on it and use these as a set of practices. And I think the way that you talk about the expectation effect, it's really neat that it has changed your trajectory with your depression. And I imagine that for people reading it, it will be the same kind of transformative effect for many readers. So I just want to say that you cover loads of ground in the book that we didn't have time to cover, like intelligence, learning, creativity, aging, fitness, and so much more. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it's really an incredible book. Everyone should pick it up. And let me just give you a chance to say where else can people find you and find out more about your work.
Yeah, so, I love hearing from readers. So I'm on Twitter, D_A_Robson. But also you can come to my website, which is davidrobson.me, where I have kind of updates. You can read my portfolio of my journalistic writing. Yeah, those are the two main places. And there's a contact form if you do want to get in touch.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And this was such a fun conversation for me. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. I love the questions and it was, a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our strategic consultant, Michael Harold, and our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're having a mental health emergency, dial 911. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.